Almighty. Lord, the Lord gave me that flow. Who you think? Who you think? Yeah, I've been given every little thing I asked for. I just wanna go to heaven with a passport. I know you got my back like a
You are listening to the
Palestine
Palestinian American podcast. I'm your host, Nader Ihmoud. I'm joined by my co-host and our Politics Edition guest editor, Rasha Mubarak of Unbought Power. On today's episode, we are joined by Assistant Professor in the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, and co-founder of Palestinian Youth Movement, Loubna Qutami. How you doing, Loubna? Thanks for joining us.
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Ahlan sahla. I just love being, it's interesting, like these virtual spaces is so tiring and exhausting, but I also am super grateful because I get to be in spaces with all of you. And Loubna, okay, like I reflect always on that Facebook message about when you first told me about PYM, right? Like, and I think you all were traveling to another country, and my very Palestinian parents said no of me traveling at the time. And it's something that like is just it's so beautiful to see how full force it is, and not just in full force, but being one of the leading advocacy groups for our liberation. And on top of that, your academic background and being this dope assistant professor in these studies. And I just want to get into it. Like, what made you help start PYM and go into the direction of being in academics?
Well,
Academia.
First off, thank you so much both for having me, Rasha. We go way back. We've done a lot of organizing together through the National Network of Arab American Communities. Really great times, I think, in my life. I'll always remember them. And Nader, it's so great to be in conversation and dialogue with you. I mean, when I really think that like my organizing for Palestine really began, like most people in this country, on campus, right? I mean, I think everything before we arrived to university is really about how our families facilitate our relationship to Palestine and the community and organizing. But once a lot of us, go on to university campuses, I think that's when we really start to gain our own experiences. And I think for me, when I started at San Francisco State University, it was like one of the last campuses that had a GUPS chapter, the General Union of Palestinian Students. So I joined, and me and a lot of my student organizer friends, we were working toward the creation of the Edward Said mural, the Palestinian cultural mural honoring Dr. Edward Said, thinking it would just be like, a form of cultural expression of our identities and histories. But we faced a really intense repression campaign at that time. And this is like really early 2000s. And it really kind of motivated in me, like, I think I became more dedicated to the struggle. I was like, they're going to try to silence us. And I was like so offended by it as a young organizer that it made me like really more committed and more dedicated, I think, to organizing. And I think out of that GUPS experience, I had the chance to study in Palestine, and that really fortified a like newfound love and appreciation for the homeland and for our people. And I think those two experiences together, they allowed me to join this Palestinian Youth Conference. So like when I went to the first conference, the first Palestinian Youth Network conference that I had attended, it was 2007 in France. And I thought I was going to like an educational conference. But I think the experience there, like meeting Palestinian youth from across 28 different countries, I mean, North America, South America, Australia, the Arab region, in Palestine and in Europe, realizing that in some cases we didn't even speak the same language. Like some of the youth didn't speak Arabic or English, so we're just like communicating with each other and like through body language and But I think like really being in that convening and learning that there was this whole community of Palestinian young people across the world that were doing the same kind of student activism, that were facing the same kind of repression, that had the same kind of like longing and love for their country that they couldn't return to, or people who were within the homeland who were experiencing the occupation on a day-to-day level and connecting with us as Palestinians, not as solidarity activists, like that was really moving and inspiring for me, because I found a place in a movement that was all young people, you know, so there wasn't like this, you're a youth, so you don't know any better kind of thing that happened there. And we were all Palestinians. So there wasn't, you know, this kind of like trying to find your place or your voice as a Palestinian. Like we were finding our voices and our places collectively as a new generation. That was really motivating for me. So I kind of stuck with it. And I guess the rest was history. I joined the follow-up committee, and we prepared toward the foundation of the organization. And so we formally launched as the Palestinian Youth Network in 2008 in Madrid, Spain.
So you guys were first the network and then now PYM. When did you guys shift to PYM?
So that's a great question. So I think the early years of the PYN, we were really just gathering Palestinian youth from all over the world and engaging in a series of discussions about our shared struggles, shared dilemmas, our aspirations, how to assume a more relevant role in our liberation struggle, especially after the Oslo Accords. So a lot of those early years, between like 2006, when the network began, all the way up to 2011, it was about developing a common language and a common vision and common set of goals among Palestinian youth from 33 different countries. And that's not an easy task, right? Like
No.
Palestinian youth from 33 different countries, you're trying to account for all of the differences of experience, of outlooks. And we were, you know, also coming from really different political orientations and like ideological affiliations. So it was a really hard thing, but I think of those early years as like a pedagogical approach, where we were trying to understand what Palestine was to us, who Palestinians were, trying to appreciate and accept our differences. And we were doing that through a number of summer schools and summer camps and different campaigns where we were sort of learning and growing together. We eventually changed our name to the movement in 2011 at our second International General Assembly, and that was in Istanbul, Turkey. And the reason we changed to the movement is because we realized we weren't just young people that were networking with each other, right? Like we were coming up with shared visions and shared ideas and strategies on how to move together. And so with our new structure and and more clearly refining our politics, we also changed the name to the movement.
Like, put me in your, like, paint the picture for me, because like this is you're blowing my mind. How old are you, and you're traveling to France and Istanbul and already doing the work that half of us can't even dream of even completing in our lifetime? You're doing this. What, like, who's funding this for you?
Yeah,
Like,
that's
how
a
are
great
you doing
question.
all this?
That's a great question. So we really were like young people that were just trying to do things. So at the time, when I joined, I was 20 years old. So I was the youngest person in the leadership position. Now I'm like a graduating member of PYM. I've been in it for 13 years, right? So like at that time, I was one of the youngest. Most people were in their mid-20s. A lot of people were students or graduate students, but a lot weren't. And, you know, sometimes here and there we would get grants from like foundations that supported Palestinian youth empowerment or activism, but a lot of the time we were paying money out of pocket. You also have to remember, this is like pre-social media being like a really important force in our life. This is like at a time where I, as a young person, didn't have an international phone plan. So like we were trying to use Skype. There was no WhatsApp. So like a lot of our connection was in person. And the way that we would make it happen is literally like, you know, putting aside, like I, for example, made a specific like PYM piggy bank where I'd have to put like $1 a day in there, right? So that like next time there was a conference, I'd have the money. But a lot of times for our camps and schools, like we would rely on our local community. So we noticed that when you send them emails and stuff, they're less reluctant to give. So at some point, like I think for one of our summer schools in 2010, the PYM chapter in the Bay Area, we were literally walking from store to store, like just talking with the Ammos and being like, hey, listen, we're this group of Palestinian youth. We have like this international network. There's this conference, we really need money. And so they'd be like, okay, Yani, like they would like want to shajja the youth. I don't think they really had a lot of faith in us, but some of them wanted to support just for the sake of supporting us. So they'd like pull out $100 from the cash register, sometimes $20, sometimes more. And it was very grassroots. I will say that the money was very difficult. There were some conferences where like we left it like thousands of dollars in debt, and like we're kept trying to like ask people for donations or loans to pay off debt, and then we'd fall into debt in other places. But yeah, it was definitely grassroots, and it was young people just trying to figure it out.
That's that Palestinian hustle right there.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. That's real. So like, would you, you know, because you were a young person that was doing the real work, like Nader said, at such a young age, would you say that's your earliest moment where you're like dived into this work, or what was your earliest moment where you're like, okay, this is where I'm destined, this is where I need to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a lot of early moments, but they all kind of served different purposes. Like I did grow up in a way in a like politicized household where my family, they were involved in the struggle, especially before the Oslo Accord. So we were like taken out as children to the protests and things like that. I was in high school when 9/11 happened. That was a huge turning point for me because I really think up until that point, I just thought of myself as an ordinary kid. And so it wasn't until after that moment where like I started to see even my relationships with friends and peers through like a politicized lens, and like, you know, thinking about like, I just remember like a couple of my friends like running down the halls after 9/11 with like American flags. And I was just like, you're such a nationalist. Like, I mean, it was just this like moment that really like showed people's anti-Arab, like, you know, perspectives. And it made me more like committed to sort of exploring Arab and Palestinian identity and politics. Of course, as I mentioned, my student organizing was a huge moment for me, and my studying at Birzeit University in the Palestine and Arabic Studies program, that was really major for me. But PYN was really the first place where I started to like, I really believe that we could do something. Like it wasn't like you just do this out of like a sense of national burden or obligation, or because so many generations of Palestinians, you know, have done organizing, but I was really just inspired. I was inspired to know that there was this whole community all over the world that felt the kind of isolation that I had, that did have the same aspirations I had, that were pushing me and challenging me to think deeper and grow more. And we fought a lot. Like, don't get it wrong. We were not like, I mean, we all had really close, loving relationships in a way. And there was a lot of joy and celebration in our international convenings, but there was also a lot of tension and a lot of conflict and a lot of challenges. But that really inspired me because I felt like there was something really raw and real about the engagement, as opposed to pretending that we're all on the same page and that we all want the same things and that, you know, all of our strategies are working effectively. Like we were pushing ourselves to think about what was missing or what we needed to create differently, you know?
That's what it really means to be in relationship with one another, is to be able to struggle together. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the struggle, that's a part of it, is being able to really struggle together. And I think just learning that there's so many different iterations of, even within the youth, of like Palestinian activists, right? So what would be your advice to folks who are involved and struggling or trying to get involved? And if you can speak to a young 20-year-old Loubna on that flight, international flight, like what would you say to her? What we say to other folks trying to do this kind of work?
I have this like memory in France in the first Palestinian Youth Network meeting that I was in, and it was like the last couple days. By the way, I should tell you, this goes back to Nader's question about money. Like we were so broke that it was like 100 of us that were staying in this random like old French boarding school, that it was an 11-day summit. And by the 5th day, like the hot water was completely cut off, and it was like November France freezing weather. And by the 8th day, we didn't have any water at all. And the food was awful. I mean, it was just like horrible conditions. So we were all really exhausted. Like more than half of the people got super sick because we hadn't accounted for the fact that people are coming from different countries with like different viruses. And anyway, I just say all that as so you can kind of imagine the context.
It's real, yeah.
Saying that today just blows my mind.
Yeah, I mean, most of our meetings, honestly, there was one meeting where we met in Denmark for the international board, and we had no money. So there was this random Palestinian community member who gave us his apartment, and we literally were just sleeping on the floor of this really tiny like apartment. There was like 10 of us in there. So it was, but anyway.
This is Denmark you're talking about.
That was Denmark. But
see, like, you're so international. Like, she's just flexing. Like,
it sounds glorious.
Right?
I'm trying to show you how cold a lot of these meetings were, how freezing, how we all got so sick.
Mind you, Loubna met me in Dearborn. Like,
boring.
Dearborn was fun though, and we at least had those DoubleTree hotels where they gave us those chocolate cookies.
Those cookies are the best.
Yeah. But anyway, what I was saying was, at the end of this France convening, we were all tired, we were all sick, we were all like hadn't slept, hadn't eaten properly, like hadn't taken proper showers because there's no more water. And I remember that they were trying to like do nominations for a follow-up committee. And I was like, oh no, like I can't, someone had nominated me. And I said, oh no, like, first of all, there's two reasons I can't do it. First of all, like, I don't know anything about this, right? Like, I was coming from the US. All I had known was student organizing in the US. My Arabic wasn't the strongest. I really felt, as much as I felt like an insider, I felt a little bit like an outsider too. And I felt like really young and not like I didn't have a lot of experience or knowledge. And the second thing was that I thought I was so busy. Like I was like, I can't do it because I have a lot going on. And anyways, my friends basically, or like the people I had met there, they basically pressured me. And then I became this, you know, leader of this international network. And that to me is a really important teaching moment, because I think a lot of young people, they think that they don't know enough. They feel insecure about their belonging to Palestine or their language or their access. There's a lot of insecurities and a lot of feeling of like inauthenticity or like lack of belonging or lack of preparation to really be a leader, or that like it doesn't fit into our life and that we have so much going on. And by my peers pressuring me, like my whole life changed. Like Palestine through transnational youth organizing basically became the center of my life. And I had to be pushed into that. So I guess my takeaway is like that we should push each other, but we also should try to overcome some of our insecurities and also try to really be imaginative about the futures that we can create for ourselves. Because at that time I couldn't imagine what that would look like. And it was only through the experience that like I started to become a lot more creative in the way that I was thinking about organizing and about Palestine in general.
Man, a lot of what, like, you've been inspiring throughout this entire conversation, Loubna. One of the main reasons why I created Palestine in America is to kind of, you know, obviously highlight the work that Palestinians like you are doing, but also take note of what was happening before, you know, we even existed here. You know, I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like before me and you were even born, what was going on? What was the work that was being done? And like, it's so cool to slowly go back and you're a part of that history. So that's crazy. But that leads me to my next question. Like, instead of just focusing on the past, what are you doing now? What do you wish to accomplish in the near future? Whether that be with PYM or your work at the university, but what do you hope to accomplish, you know, maybe in the next year or 5 years or whatever?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Nader. I think, you know, there came a point by like 2014, 2015, where the international PYM really suffered tremendously. And a big part of it had to do with the changes that were happening in the region and a lot of kind of depleted morale after some of the opportunities that were brought forward from the Arab uprisings kind of closed their doors on us. And so soon after that, the international PYM kind of lost its momentum, but PYM USA really started to grow at that time. And it could, you know, in part be this cultural and political separation from like the organizational dynamics happening back home in our region and in Europe. So we had a little bit of distance from those complexities in a way. And because it was like 2015 was a really right moment for organizing in the United States. If we think about like the scores of student divestment resolutions, the like a new wave of attacks on Palestine organizers in the US, right? So I think, you know, I am now like a graduating member of PYM. But I know that now here in the United States, there is a thriving youth movement, thriving student movement through SJP and NSJP, growing feminist and women's cooperatives and collectives, so much like new forms of cultural production and work that I'm really inspired and excited to see. And so with this kind of growth of these different sectors of our community and different kind of forms of work that are all doing their part in our broader struggle, I'm really starting to focus more on my role in the university and as an academic and as a scholar, because not that I see that separate from community organizing, but I think a lot of the really profound intellectual and theoretical lessons that I learned about movement building, about transnationalism, about history, about anti-colonialism, I learned it through the movement, right? I matched it with the text that I was reading as a grad student in ethnic studies, but it only clicked for me because it was the same arguments that I was having in the movement. And we weren't arguing about it in this like posturing way, like, how do we look more intellectual to the world? We were arguing about those ideas in the cultivation of our vision, to think about what was the most suitable vision for the liberation of Palestine. So now that I'm on this other side, housed within the university, I really am thinking about, what is the role of academics? What is the role of the university? What is the role of scholarship in terms of fostering and supporting the creation and the sustainability of movements for social transformation? Like, I don't think we need to teach people on the streets things about anti-colonialism and revolution and freedom, but we need to offer resources, and we need to offer tools, and we need to offer access to intellectual works that can fortify and strengthen these movements. And I think that this is really important because our movements as Palestinians and as people of color, they've never been anti-intellectual. Like right now, our frustrations with the intellectualism in the movement is that it represents a kind of elitism or ivory tower academic thing. And I totally agree with that in many ways, but that doesn't mean that our movements were anti-intellectual. We've always had revolutionary philosophies that we created.
And we always quote revolutionary philosophy, and we always look to them, right? Like, exactly. And they were the movement builders.
Exactly. And yeah, that's the thing. Like, if you think about a lot of the revolutionary literature that we read from the 60s and 70s, a lot of those people were movement leaders. They weren't professors at universities. Yes, sometimes they were both. Sometimes they happened to be both, right? But yeah, so for me, I think like really doing my part to support not just Palestinians, not just Arabs, but students of color, Black and Indigenous immigrant communities, to give them, you know, access to tools and resources and vocabularies within the university, and to help cultivate trajectories that can challenge the university and the academy as a site of like, you know, racism and colonialism. I mean, universities are so complicit in subjugation of oppressed people. So playing that role, I think, is really important as part of this broader ecosystem of cultural workers and youth movement practitioners and feminist and women's movements and so forth in the liberation for Palestine.
Loubna, I just want to say, like, I'm just so grateful for people like you. Like, no, for real. Like, I honestly, like, your brilliance, and like, you know, sometimes people are either or, but the fact that you encompass, like, you're an organizer, you're an activist, and like you can like be a professor and like write these papers that are so important to the revolution. And a lot of times I tell folks, like, in this work, there's not like, because some people are like, oh, you know, taking it to the streets is too much, or focusing too much on electoral, like, and not understanding that all of these elements play a significant role, and you can't leave one out the other. So to see you embody so many of that is like, Allah yahmiku, but you know, so I just want to say, like,
thank you, Rasha,
appreciate you so much, like, Anjad.
Yeah.
And like, on that note, like, the fact that, like, because when this question that we've been asking folks is usually like centered around like one of the avenues that they work, the lanes that they work in, but considering that you work in so many of these lanes, what does a free world mean to you, and what does that look like in getting there, with the understanding that that might not be in our lifetime, maybe inshallah, but what does that look like to you, and what does that road look like and feel like?
Well, first off, Rasha, I'm like always in awe by you as well, and always like love being in struggle and in conversation and in movement with you. And I know that like we haven't been able to sustain that in many places, but it's always kind of coalesces and we reconnect in different times and moments of the world. But I think, you know, this is a great question around what is a free world. And I think here I want to talk specifically around my training in ethnic studies, because I, after my undergraduate degree, I did an MA in ethnic studies at SF State. And that was when Dr. Rabab Abdelhadi had just started the Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diasporas program there. So following, I did an MA there, and then following that, I did a PhD in ethnic studies at UCR. And initially, you know, I really didn't think I would be going into a field like ethnic studies, because I always read ethnic studies as very domestic, and I really was interested in global things. I was interested in global power, power relations and oppression and colonialism, of course, as it relates to the US, but not concentrating on like, on US specific racialized systems in the absence of thinking of like broader context. But I really feel like the type of mentorship that I had in my ethnic studies journey is very different than what a lot of other people have gotten. And like the bridging of the local to the global, the bridging of the struggles for indigenous communities, Black communities, Asian Pacific Islander communities, immigrant Latinx communities with our struggles as Arab and Muslim communities or as Palestinians has been really instrumental in terms of thinking and having access to the lessons of all these other revolutionary traditions, and how they can kind of cultivate revolutionary outlooks in our own context as Arabs or Muslims or Palestinians, right? So for me, when I think of a free world, I'm thinking obviously of a world free of Zionist colonialism, dispossession, subjugation, and occupation. But I'm also understanding very truthfully that that simply cannot be realized in the absence of freedom from other systems of oppression, because Israel and Zionist actors worldwide have deeply intimate relationships with other systemic forms of oppression, like policing in the US or the prison system in the US, or even like the very settler colonial land theft logics and policies of this country. So a free world to me definitely doesn't restrict it to one community over another. It's not about Palestinians in the absence of justice and freedom for the Arab masses, for example, and justice and freedom from the Arab masses, not just from Western allied regimes, but also from authoritarian Arab regimes that are inflicting like a lot of violence and harm on their people, even if they claim to be so-called anti-imperialists, right? So I believe in freedom. I believe in unconditional freedom. I don't believe in justifying certain attacks on freedom in the name of defending a potential ally that we might have.
Right.
And I also think that political freedom has to be connected to social freedom. Like, I think that our social freedoms as a community, like we have to keep challenging the social constraints within our community, like the way that we understand age and gender and sexuality, the way that we understand the restrictions, right? Like, you know, I remember wanting to go to my first Palestinian Youth Network conference.
I don't mean to cut you off, Loubna.
Okay.
But Zoom is going to cut you off.
Okay. Cut me off, Zoom.
No. But
they've done it before to Palestinians. So.
But that was a great way to end it. I really wish we had more time, because I definitely was inspired by hearing about how you got to where you are today. So definitely have to do this again. Have to thank our listeners for listening to this episode of Palestine America's podcast.
Please ease that pain from mama, put that pain on me, Lord, please help me win this.